I never imagined a single late evening drive could change so much in my life. My name is Emily, and this happened on one of those quiet nights when the streets are nearly empty and the only sound you can hear is the wind brushing against your car windows. It all began when my old friend Daniel called me, his voice trembling on the phone. There was something in the way he spoke that made me feel uneasy. He had never been the type to ask for help easily, but that night he did. He said he needed a ride home because his hands wouldn't stop shaking and he was too afraid to drive himself. I didn't think twice about it. Daniel had been part of my life since we were teenagers. We grew up in the same neighborhood, spent summers biking around the block, and knew each other's families like they were our own. He was like a constant in my life, someone I could always trust. So when he asked me to come, I grabbed my keys and told him I'd be there in 10 minutes. By the time I pulled up to the little coffee shop where he'd been waiting, I could already see him from a distance. He was standing under one of those flickering streetlights, his shoulders hunched and his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets like he was trying to keep himself from falling apart. It was strange because Daniel was always so composed. I rolled down the passenger window and called out his name. He lifted his head, and that was when I noticed the fear in his eyes. He got in the back seat instead of the front, which surprised me. I teased him about it lightly, saying something like, "What are you doing back there? You know you can sit up front." But he just muttered something under his breath and leaned back into the seat, breathing heavily. The air in the car changed instantly. It wasn't like any other ride I'd ever given him before. Something was wrong. I started the car and pulled away from the curb, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. He looked pale, almost like he'd seen something terrible, and I didn't want to press him too hard, so I let the silence sit for a few minutes. After a while, I couldn't hold back anymore and asked softly, "Are you okay, Daniel?" He hesitated, staring out of the window, then finally said, "I don't know. I can't stop shaking." At first, I thought maybe he had too much coffee or something, but the way his voice cracked told me this was much deeper than a caffeine rush. His shoulders quivered, and I could hear his breath catching. It was like he was trying not to cry, but the effort was making him physically tremble. We drove through the quiet streets, the sound of the tires on the pavement filling the space between us. I told him to take deep breaths to calm down, but he just whispered, "It's not that simple." His voice was low, like he was afraid someone else might hear. I pulled over to the side of the road after a few blocks because I didn't feel right just driving while he was clearly breaking down. I turned around to look at him properly. His face was flushed now, his hands shaking as he gripped the seatbelt. I reached back to place my hand gently on his arm. "Daniel, what happened?" I asked, and my own voice shook because I wasn't used to seeing him like this. He took a long time to answer. The seconds felt like minutes. Then he said, "I thought I was okay. I thought I could handle everything on my own, but tonight, I just couldn't." His words broke something inside me because I had known Daniel all my life, but I realized in that moment that there was a part of him I had never seen. This wasn't about a simple bad day. This was about years of holding everything in. I put the car back in gear and started driving again, slower this time. "You don't have to handle everything alone," I told him gently. "You've always been there for me. Let me be here for you now." We drove past rows of houses with their porch lights on, past the empty grocery store parking lot where we used to skateboard when we were younger. Every memory seemed to come back to me as I tried to find the right words. He started talking slowly, in bits and pieces, like the words were too heavy to carry all at once. He told me that things at home hadn't been good, that he'd been trying to pretend everything was fine for the sake of his family and his job, but deep down, he was exhausted. And that earlier that evening, he'd gotten into a terrible argument with his father, one that left him feeling like he wasn't enough. He left the house in such a rush that he couldn't even think straight. By now, he was crying silently, wiping at his face with the sleeve of his jacket, and I could hear his breath hitching behind me. I pulled into a park where we used to hang out as teenagers. It was late, so there was no one around. I parked the car and left the engine running for the heater. Then I turned around again, unbuckled my seatbelt, and just looked at him. Seeing him like that made me feel so protective. I climbed into the back seat with him, sitting right next to him, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. I just put my hand on top of his and held it there until his shaking slowed down a little. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked finally. "I didn't want you to see me like this," he admitted. "I didn't want anyone to." That broke my heart. For years, I had leaned on Daniel when I needed help, and it never occurred to me that maybe he needed someone to lean on, too. We stayed there for almost an hour. He told me everything about the weight he had been carrying, the expectations he felt crushing him, the loneliness that no one else seemed to notice. And I listened. I didn't judge him or try to fix it. I just let him speak until he had nothing left to say. By the time he was finished, he wasn't shaking as much anymore. He leaned his head against my shoulder, exhausted from everything he had let out. And I just sat there, holding him, promising silently to myself that I would never let him feel alone again. Eventually, I drove him home. When we got to his house, he hesitated before getting out, looking at me with red, tired eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, and I could tell that it came from the deepest part of his heart. That night didn't just end when he got out of the car. It stayed with me for a long time. It taught me how important it is to pay attention to the people around you, even the ones who seem the strongest. You never know what they might be going through. Since that night, Daniel and I have been closer than ever. He started opening up more, and I started making sure he always knew that he had someone to count on. Sometimes I think about that moment, sitting in the back seat of my car with him shaking beside me, and I realize it was the first time I truly understood what it means to be there for someone, not just in words, but in action. It wasn't a romantic night, and it wasn't anything you see in movies. It was real life. Raw, messy, and deeply human. Even now, every time I drive past the park late at night, I remember how different things could have been if I hadn't answered his call. And I'm grateful that I did. Because that night reminded me that no one, no matter how strong they appear, should ever have to carry their pain alone.